Hello, you cool cats and kittens. I'm going to go ahead and teach you guys about Ronald Reagan today. And I'm going to try to be quick because there's a lot of it, and I don't want this to be like a 30-minute video. I want you guys to actually finish the video. So let's go ahead and start. And I'm not wearing any makeup. My hair done. My husband was like, oh, just let your hair be natural. Look at this natural hair. It's horrible. Anyways, let's see, share my screen. Here we go. All right, the 1980s. What do you guys know about the 1980s? I love the 80s. Completely different from the 70s. It's so crazy. I was actually born in the 1980s, and I don't really know like a lot about it because I was only a baby. But the 1980s, I think about like girls with their crazy hair to the side, all that hairspray, and I think of like neon colors and high waist pants and tights, and people with their workout gear on and their headbands, and I don't know, it's just a lot of retro stuff. So here's a good idea of the 1980s. Madonna and Michael Jackson, Back to the Future, Rubik Cube, arcade video games like Pac-Man and, Terminator. There's like so much E.T., Star Wars. 1980s was awesome. Okay, so 1980s, you should also think of Ronald Reagan. He was president all throughout the 1980s. He was also known as the president to bring back conservatism, just trying to make the country more conservative. If you guys remember, the 60s and 70s were really, really crazy. Like the 60s, the civil rights movement, all these assassinations, it was chaotic. In the 70s, a lot of crime, drugs, rock and roll, hippies, think about that. And there was like this economic recession, the oil crisis, and just a whole bunch of other things, the Vietnam War, early 70s, late 60s. So Ronald Reagan just kind of changes all that. Okay, groups supporting Ronald Reagan. We have the moral majority, and the moral majority, just think of like they were hardcore evangelical fundamentalist Christians, all right? They wanted to bring back religion to the central place of Americans' lives. And, they just felt like the 70s was just the complete opposite of what the moral majority stood for. And so, like I said, they're just trying to bring back religion, bring back traditional values, the way it used to be. And there's actually a lot of Republicans in Congress in the 1980s that supported or were the moral majority that had these ideas. And Ronald Reagan supported them. They supported Ronald Reagan. And that's that. The moral majority votes for Ronald Reagan. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, this is very controversial, the NRA. People either love the NRA or they're like strongly against it. Well, for the very first time in the 1980 election in which Ronald Reagan ran, the NRA actually endorsed a presidential candidate. And meaning like they, contributed a lot of money. They donated a lot of money to Ronald Reagan for this election, for his candidacy. And in return, it's kind of like an agreement. The NRA will go ahead and will contribute funds to a president. And then if that person wins, then, it's kind of like, the president has to fulfill their promise and kind of like pay back the NRA. In other words, like not literally pay back the NRA, but support the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, and just kind of protect the NRA, protect those, those gun owner rights. So, and since then, the NRA has endorsed so many people, like you wouldn't even believe it. Some of the people, even like Democrats, which, you know, Democrats are not really for the NRA. They're not for the Second Amendment. But you wouldn't believe, if you were to look it up, you would see. You would be like, what? That person? For an example. Okay, anyways, Ronald Reagan became president in 1981. The election was 1980. So I'm actually getting ahead of myself. I'm supposed to talk about Ronald Reagan, like leading up to him being president. He was a Republican, conservative, right? Republicans and conservatives, they go hand in hand. He was from Illinois. He actually was governor of California for almost a decade. And then he actually was an actor also before he became governor, before he joined politics. He favored free enterprise and just, you know, just allowing businesses to kind of do what they want without so much government involvement, without government regulating businesses, putting all these restrictions. The 60s and 70s, the government did that. They were all up in businesses, if that makes sense. And, you know, businesses hated that the government was regulating and controlling everything. And Ronald Reagan's like, hey, you choose me, we won't have this problem. Businesses get to do what they want. We can go back to true free enterprise. He believed in just a smaller role in the government, just, you know, like I said, just not so much government involvement in businesses and in the lives of Americans. He was known as the great communicator. He was very relaxed. He wasn't so uptight. He was kind of like an average person. The way he talked, he was very charming. People loved that. He seemed very simple. But then he also wanted he also wanted his enemies to fear him and fear the U.S. because it seemed like many didn't fear the United States in the 70s. Give me 1 second. I need to plug in my battery charger. Okay, I need to go faster. All right, Ronald Reagan. I love this, like Rambo, but Ronbo. And that's totally not Ronald Reagan's body. I'm sure it was at one point, though. Anyways, election of 1980. So Ronald Reagan wins all the states in red. And he's actually running against Carter. Carter was president, but Carter only survived 1 term. Not literally, but I mean, like, he just wasn't reelected for a 2nd term, which really sucks. That's kind of an embarrassment. George Bush Sr. was Ronald Reagan's vice president, so that's how Bush ended up becoming in the spotlight. And we know that Bush became president later on. Anyways, domestic issues. Early on, March 30th, 1981, this is the first year that Ronald Reagan is president, there was an assassination attempt on him. He was actually shot, and it was crazy. A few others were also shot as well that were in the area. He had just finished giving like a speech, and right outside there was a crazy man, like literally a psycho, who decided to try to kill him. And it's so crazy. When they interviewed him or asked him why he did this, he had said that he was actually trying to get the attention of his like Hollywood love of his life. Some of you guys remember her. Actually, I can't believe I forgot her name. But you guys know what I'm talking about. Anyways, you've seen her before in movies. But anyways, that was just really psycho. I guess, you know, presidents had a bad rap and he wanted to be the one to, you know, do this. You know, it was as if he thought he would be seen as a hero, but no, that's totally psychotic. Anyways, he ended up going to prison, but also like being in a mental institution at the same time for the rest of his life. He actually pled not guilty, and he was actually found not guilty because of reasons of insanity. So yeah, he was confined to a psychiatric facility for the rest of his life. And I heard that that they were going to let him go recently. Someone had mentioned that to me. For some reason, I don't remember what. He's really old now, but still, that's crazy if they did that. Anyways, Reaganomics, how fun. Economics, economic policies, reform policies of Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan had to live up to what he was giving speeches about when he was running for president. He promised that businesses would be regulated less by the government, more free enterprise. He wanted budget cuts, meaning that the government doesn't spend so much money on just different things. And if the government doesn't have such a big budget, because remember, the government's budget is because of people's taxes. Like all of our taxes goes into a big old piggy bank for the government, and the government uses that money on spending for different things. So if you cut the government's budget, you can cut taxes, because there's no need to have to collect so much taxes from the people if the government isn't going to spend a lot. So people love this idea that the government was willing to cut people's taxes. And going back to the whole business regulation, he just figured if businesses are free to do what they want, they can do what they need, they can create the jobs they need, people will have jobs, people will have money in their pockets, the economy will be great. I remember the 70s was crazy. He's trying to fix all that. One thing he was very big on was increasing defense spending, building up our militaries, continue testing with bombs, building, just training our military, our soldiers to prepare for anything. This is still the Cold War. Anyways, after everything, the 1980s was actually pretty good. Confidence was restored, the economy recovered. This actually worked out really well. And today, many businesses, many government officials try to go back to Reaganomics, Ronald Reagan's idea of economics, to trying to fix the economy. All right, look at the graph below. What states are experiencing the greatest growth? All right, so right here from this line below, and if you look at this key right here, the dark purple means more than 1 million people in population growth in migration, and then this next light purple, also 200,000 to 1 million. So if you look at this, the whole southern region is basically purple, meaning that they experience a huge growth in population density due to migration patterns. And then net population losses, so everything in red to orange, if you want to call that, or coral, that means people are leaving this area. So a lot of people left this whole area right here, but this experienced a lot of population growth, so it's pretty obvious that people migrated from the north, the northeast, what do we call that? The Midwest, that's what you call it, the Midwest. They migrated to the south, to the Sun Belt. We call this the Sun Belt region, and the Sun Belt migration of the 1970s and 80s. So why were people leaving the Midwest and the Northeast and moving to the Sun Belt region? Why would you want to move to like places like Arizona, the desert, Nevada? All they have is Las Vegas right here at the very bottom. Well, technological advancements, air conditioning. We have air conditioning that's invented. Thank God for air conditioning. Dams that can provide running water, clean water, hydroelectricity. So all of that was developed in a lot of these rural areas of the South, therefore just making it a lot easier and making it affordable for people to just be able to get up and move. So I have more to the reason why people left the Northeast and Midwest. But before I get to that, Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the very first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. This is a breakthrough because we have the feminist movement of the 1970s, and Ronald Reagan makes this very big step in the feminist movement by appointing a woman to the Supreme Court. And she's very conservative. Ronald Reagan is a conservative. He's a Republican, so she go hand in hand. So she just kind of like tilts the balance and makes it more conservative, the Supreme Court, which means more support for Ronald Reagan's policies, that they won't get reversed, and all that. Peace through strength. I talked about Ronald Reagan wanting to increase defense spending. So he just put a lot of more money into the military, trying to build up the military, allowing just different people who wouldn't, or just making it more possible for the military to just increase more, not drafting, but just more recruitment, basically, and just more training, just making sure these military soldiers aren't just filling up a position, but they're actually capable of being good Marines, good Army soldiers, good Navy men, and so forth, Air Forcemen. Peace through strength. So going back to that, peace through strength, Ronald Reagan, like I said, we're still in the middle of, not in the middle, but we're more towards the end of the Cold War era. This isn't just against the Soviet Union. This is also against other countries that have been giving us issues, like countries in the Middle East, communist countries around the world. We needed them to know that we were a very strong country. We have a very strong military, and we're building this military up, and they need to know about that so they can fear us and think twice before trying to mess with us. Strategic Defense Initiative. This was a pretty cool idea that Ronald Reagan and his military came up with. It's an idea. It did not actually happen. So the Strategic Defense Initiative was the idea of having lasers, laser beams that can be shot either from the ground or from satellites in the sky. And these laser beams can actually stop missiles mid-air. It's kind of crazy. So like say Russia decides to send us a nuclear missile. Well, because of satellites that we have in the air and just different types of, command centers like on ground in the earth, they can detect these missiles coming, and therefore they can use laser beams to stop the missiles from actually reaching their destination. Pretty cool idea, aka Star Wars. I didn't make this up. This is actually like a real thing in the history books. And it's like, where did they get the idea of calling it Star Wars? Well, Star Wars, the first Star Wars movies happened in the late 1970s, and Star Wars was really big in the 1980s. So that's where they got this idea. And well, I think, yeah, they got the whole idea from Star Wars, I'm pretty sure, watching too many of those Star Wars movies. Anyways, we put a lot of money, billions of money, into trying to make this laser beams, try to prevent missiles. But you know what? This is 1980s. That is too far-fetched of an idea. We're not even close to having technology like that to be able to stop missiles. But that was under Ronald Reagan. Cool idea. I think we're still in the works of trying to do that right now. And this was a big deal. Like, everybody knew about it. It was in the news. It was in newspapers, Time magazine. What is terrorism? We all have a very similar idea of what terrorism is. You think of terrorists, you automatically think 9/11. Terrorism can come in many different shapes and forms, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Middle Eastern Muslim extremists. It could be, terrorists within the United States. Anyways, we started to experience terrorism in the 1980s. Like true terrorism. It's just that, the media's gotten so big and powerful that now whenever we hear of a terrorist attack, we remember it. Like, it goes down in the history books. But there was terrorism, like I said, since the 1980s that were pretty big. I don't know why. I guess, like I said, the media, that it wasn't so big on reporting about things like this. I'm going to skip all this. Lebanon and terrorism. So there was a terrorist attack in Lebanon. Lebanon is a small little country. Let me show you. Look here, Syria. Some of you guys know where Syria is at. Here's Turkey. Here is Lebanon. Here's Israel. We talked about Israel the other day. Lebanon right here. The capital of Lebanon is Beirut. So Lebanon was going through this crazy civil war, and the United States had soldiers, and even the French had soldiers in Lebanon to try to help this, ease this civil war, make it come to an end. Remember, we talked about how Americans, our soldiers, our military, we're just all over the place in everybody's business. And countries do not like that. If they have a civil war, they won't handle it themselves. They don't want Americans involved in their civil war if it's not hurting other countries. But sometimes it does hurt other countries, sometimes, usually economically. Anyways, going back to this, there was a huge terrorist attack in Lebanon. So like I said, our military was there, and we had some military barracks. These buildings right here were military barracks, meaning like that's where our soldiers sleep. That's where they stay. That's where they're stationed, basically, when they're not on duty. And 2 suicide bombers, one was in one truck, one was in the other truck. They ran their truck full of explosives, and I'm talking about crazy explosives. I've never seen anything like this before. They ran their trucks into these 2 buildings. One of them was American, the other one was a French building with French paratroopers. Anyways, and it just caused a huge explosion, and 241 American Marines were killed and 58 French paratroopers. That is insane to do that much damage. Like I said, these bombs were crazy. This was October 23rd, 1983. That was one of our very first terrorist attacks that we had experienced. We talked about the Iran hostage crisis that happened under President Carter, in which those Americans were hostage for over a year, and then they were let go the day that Ronald Reagan became president. That wasn't an actual terrorist attack. That was hostage, but nobody died. This was an actual terrorist attack. Anyways, that's Lebanon. Here is the VP, the vice president, George Bush, just, out there in Lebanon. That's kind of what presidents, vice presidents, government officials do. They go and they see what's going on when something crazy like this happens. The Iran-Contra affair. This is interesting. So a lot of stuff been going on with Iran in the 1970s and 1980s. We talked about the Iran hostage crisis. Well, okay. I don't even know where to start. So 1986, this is when it all came to light, but this was brewing way before. I need to talk about Nicaragua. You're like, what? That's a little random. We're still around that time in which we're still supporting rebels that want to overthrow a communist country. So Nicaragua was communist. Nicaragua is in it's in Central America, which I think of it as the same thing. Mexico and down, right? Central America. Nicaragua had a communist government. There are some rebels in there that were trying to overthrow the government. And because we support this idea of no communism, especially in the Western Hemisphere, we wanted to support these rebels. We wanted to either provide weapons for them or give them money so they can buy weapons so they can overthrow their communist government. And this was secretly done by like CIA and stuff like that. They were doing this like secretly without trying to let Congress know. Congress had passed a law saying we're not helping any rebels anymore overthrow communist countries. Like, that's just too much money and too much drama. Like, we're gonna get out of this. But the CIA had their own agenda, which was to help these Contra rebels, anti-communists overthrow their communist government. Anyways, how do we give them the money? How do we give them the weapons? Well, something was going on with Iran. Now, remember, we have an embargo on Iran at this time, in which we weren't selling anything to Iran. We weren't buying their oil. We weren't selling anything to them because of the whole Iran hostage crisis. Like, they're being punished for what they did. But the CIA came up with this wonderful idea. Iran was fighting Iraq at the time. They needed weapons, and they wanted American weapons, but we won't trade with them, but they want American weapons. So the CIA thought of this great idea. How about we go ahead and secretly sell weapons to Iran, and then with that, we'll use the money that we get from the weapons sale, and we'll give that money over to the rebels in Nicaragua so they can buy their weapons. So that was the idea that the CIA came up with, and that's what happened. So I have a chart here. U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. That's what happens when I talk too fast. The CIA. Anyways, they used Israel as a middleman because it would be untraceable, and therefore, because we can't go directly selling stuff to Iran. We have an embargo. We'll get in trouble. We'll get caught if we're like shipping weapons to Iran. So we shipped the weapons to Israel. Israel went ahead and did this for us. They sold the weapons to Iran. Iran gave Israel the money. The money was given back to the United States, in which we used that money to give, and it says it all right here, we gave to the Contras in Nicaragua so they can continue to support their, fund their war against the communist government. So anyways, that's what happened. Totally messed up, totally wrong. Anyways, everybody found out about it. That's why I see money getting it from Iran accepting the weapons. A lot of people found out, congressmen found out about this. There was a huge trial. It was all over the TV. People were like, oh, Ronald Reagan knew about it. Ronald Reagan's like, I didn't know about it. I think Ronald Reagan did know about it. Anyways, I don't really know. It's a he said, she said type of deal. Kind of reminds me of the whole pointing fingers reminds me of the Nixon thing. Anyways, a lot of people got in trouble. High-ranked military officials, government officials, Department of Defense got in trouble and went to prison for this. And it made Ronald Reagan look really, really bad. Wow, you're doing stuff like this, going behind Congress's back, selling to our enemies, using them, what is wrong with you? But people still loved Ronald Reagan, but some were a little weird of his word. Triumph of democracy. The late 1980s, the government, the Soviet Union, Russia, but we call it the Soviet Union, right? They had, they're going through some rough times, and communism is not working in their country, in their empire. It's just all these other democratic, free enterprise, capitalistic countries are just exceeding them, and their economies are thriving, but not the Soviet Union. They got a new military, not a new military, but they got a new president, dictator, communist leader called I don't know how to say that, it's Russian, Gorbachev. I can say that, Gorbachev. And Gorbachev just basically became leader when there were all these huge economic problems with the Soviet Union. So he becomes open to new ideas. Before I get ahead of myself, so remember the Berlin Wall, the wall that was built to go across the capital of Germany, Berlin, right? It's just one city that had a huge wall, and it was because the city was divided between East and West Berlin, Democratic, Republican, Democratic and communist, just like the whole country. Germany was divided in half, Democratic West, communist East. Same thing with the capital, but that wall was in the way to keep people from the communist side from leaving. Anyways, 1989, the wall first opens up to start letting people go in and out, and people are starting to become reunited. And then Ronald Reagan makes this huge speech that goes international, that goes viral. And he tells Gorbachev, he's like, Gorbachev, tear down this wall now. And, everybody heard about it. And there was all this protesting and everything. People supported Reagan's idea, and Gorbachev approves it to tear down the Berlin Wall. And it was huge. It was a huge thing. People from all over the world came to Germany, flew to Germany, even Americans, even people I know. There's this one substitute at our school that actually was there. And he actually helped, like everybody helped, break down the wall, and he has a little piece of it. Pretty cool. Anyways, and this was a big sign that communism was ending in Europe. It's ending in Germany now. It's ending in the Soviet Union. This is 1989. The Soviet Union is probably going to fall next now, because this is Germany falling, or at least no longer turning communist. And then after this wall fell, 1 year later, Germany is reunited. West, Democratic West, and Communist East becomes one whole country, like the way it is today, Germany. It's so crazy how it was like that for a few decades, that it was separated into like kind of like two countries, communist and democratic. Anyways, this is huge, you guys. This is like, you know, a sign that the Cold War is coming to an end. And I think that's it. I did that so fast. And sure enough, the Soviet Union does fall. The communism does fall under Gorbachev. And actually in 1991, the Soviet Union, Russia now, I can say 1991, Russia, the Soviet Union falls and Russia becomes Russia and gets rid of communism, has its very first democratic election. Isn't that awesome? Like, very first election in the history of Russia. Because remember, they went from like a kingdom and all this imperialism and then communists, and then now they held an election for the first time. It's like, where have you guys been? This is the 21st century. So, no, this isn't the 21st century. It's the 20th, because it's 1991. Anyways, I'm just gibberish right now. So, we'll talk more about that in the next unit. That's it. Here's some videos you guys can watch if you are all about Ronald Reagan, the 1980s, end of communism, and the Cold War. Not the complete end. All right, you guys. Have an awesome week. Let me know if you guys need anything. Bye-bye.